Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The Slow Steps in the Attic. When I first bought the old farmhouse, I was charmed by its weathered wood, wide porch, and the way it seemed to hum with the echoes of its long history. It had been empty for at least 10 years before I moved in, and the neighbors told me it once belonged to a quiet family who simply vanished one winter. The house came cheap, too cheap for the land it sat on, and though that fact should have raised alarms, I convinced myself I was just lucky. The first few weeks passed quietly. I painted the walls, cleaned out decades of dust, and tried to ignore the sense that the house felt too still. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but rather watchful, like the hush of a room where someone has just stopped speaking. That was the silence that filled the farmhouse. The attic was the only place I hadn't touched. It was accessible by a set of pull-down stairs in the hallway ceiling, and the first time I tugged the cord, a wave of stale, cold air drifted down. I climbed halfway up, flashlight in hand, but the beam barely pierced the shadows. Cobwebs dangled like curtains, and boxes lined the edges. But the strange thing wasn't what I could see. It was what I felt. Standing there, with my head poking into the dark, I had the sudden, unshakable sense that someone was standing just out of view, watching. I shut the hatch and told myself I'd deal with it later. Then the footsteps started. The first night, I woke to a sound like slow pacing above me. Heavy, deliberate steps creaking against the attic boards. My bedroom was directly below, and I lay in the dark with my heart pounding, counting the steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, and then silence. I stayed frozen, straining to listen, but nothing else came. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been the old wood settling. But the steps came again the next night, and the night after that. Always slow, always spaced like someone carefully crossing the attic. Sometimes they stopped suddenly, as if the walker knew I was listening. Sometimes they came right above my bed, and the floorboards groaned as if under a real weight. I asked the neighbors about raccoons or stray animals, but they just shook their heads. One old man said flatly, "That attic's been walking for years. Don't go up there at night." His words left me uneasy, but I laughed it off in front of him. Deep down, I was already afraid he was right. One night, unable to stand it anymore, I climbed the attic ladder while the sound still echoed. My flashlight cut through the dark, and the footsteps stopped the second my head cleared the hatch. I shone the beam across the floor. Nothing. Just the same boxes, dust, and shadows. But the boards beneath me creaked. Not under my weight, but behind me, deeper in the dark. I spun around, the light jerking wildly, but the space was empty. Still, I felt it, that watchful silence, thicker than before. I climbed down quickly, shutting the attic tight behind me, and I didn't try again for weeks. The footsteps grew bolder. Some nights they would start just after midnight and last until dawn, a slow, steady pacing that made sleep impossible. Other nights, I'd hear them creeping down the attic stairs, though when I checked, the hatch was closed. Once, I woke to the sound of the cords swaying, tapping softly against the hallway wall. I began to dread the evenings, watching the sun sink below the fields, knowing the footsteps would return. My exhaustion grew, and my nerves frayed. Friends who visited remarked on how pale I looked, how jumpy. I never told them the truth. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Then, one stormy night, I heard the steps begin earlier than usual. The rain pounded the roof, the wind howled through the eaves, and through it all came the familiar creaking rhythm above. But this time, there was something else. A dragging sound, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a lantern instead of my flashlight, I yanked the cord and climbed into the attic. The storm outside lit the rafters with flashes of white, throwing long shadows across the boxes. At first, there was silence. I took a cautious step forward, the lantern shaking in my hand. Then, behind me, the floor groaned. I whipped around, but the attic was still. Only the rain and wind filled the silence. Heart hammering, I turned back, and that's when I saw it. In the dust across the attic floor were fresh footprints. Not old ones, not faded, but sharp impressions of bare feet leading from the far corner straight toward me. I staggered back, the lantern swinging wildly, and the attic boards groaned again, as though under an unseen weight. I fled. I didn't bother closing the hatch. I ran out of the house into the storm, not caring that the rain soaked me through. When I returned at dawn, exhausted and trembling, the house was silent. The attic was quiet, too. But the footprints were still there, etched in the dust. I tried sweeping them away, but no matter how much I cleaned, the impressions seemed to linger, faint but visible. The footsteps haven't stopped. Every night they return, sometimes slow and steady, sometimes rushing across the attic, as if whatever is up there is agitated. I've tried sleeping in other rooms, but the sound follows, always above me, no matter where I go. Now, I no longer wonder if the house is haunted. I only wonder who or what is pacing above me, and why they've never tried to come down completely. Because lately, the footsteps have been stopping closer to the attic hatch. Each night, they end just at the top of the stairs, as though whoever is walking has finally realized how thin the barrier is between us. Story 2. Footprints outside my bedroom door. I grew up in a quiet house on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew one another and nights fell heavy and still. My parents worked long hours, so I was often home alone after dark, curled up in my room with a book or music playing softly from my old stereo. The house itself wasn't particularly old or creaky, but for some reason, it always carried an atmosphere that made silence feel oppressive. It started on a night in early winter. The wind was howling through the trees outside, rattling the windows. I had just switched off the lamp and settled beneath the blankets when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought maybe it was my father returning home late, but when I sat up and glanced at the clock, it was barely past 10 p.m. He never came home that early, and besides, I hadn't heard the front door open. The footsteps were faint but steady, the sound of bare feet brushing softly against the wooden floor. They came closer, pausing right outside my bedroom door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say a word, just stood there, shifting ever so slightly, the sound of weight pressing down on the boards. I whispered, "Dad?" But there was no reply. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I lay back down, pulling the covers up over my head, my heart pounding. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been the house settling, or maybe my imagination. Somehow, I drifted off to sleep. But it didn't stop. Every night after that, around the same time, I would hear it, the faint shuffle of feet moving down the hallway, pausing outside my door. Sometimes it would last for just a few seconds, sometimes for minutes at a time. I tried telling my parents, but they laughed it off. "Old houses make noises," my mother said, brushing it aside. My father suggested it might be raccoons in the attic, but I knew better. These weren't random noises. They had rhythm. They had intent. One night, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things, I stayed awake with the lights on. I left my door cracked open slightly, enough to peer out into the hall. Midnight came, and sure enough, the sound began, soft, steady footsteps approaching. My pulse raced as the sound grew closer until I could see the faint shadow of movement just beyond the doorframe. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The shadow lingered, then shifted, as if whoever it was leaned closer to the crack in the door. My skin prickled. Then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow moved away, the footsteps retreating down the hall until silence swallowed the house again. The next morning, I found something that confirmed my fears. Right outside my door, faint but visible against the wooden floor, were damp footprints, bare, human footprints leading from the far end of the hallway directly to my door, then stopping. They didn't turn back. They didn't lead away. It was as if whoever made them had simply vanished. I scrubbed the floor clean, hoping that would be the end of it. But the following night, the footsteps returned, slower than before, almost dragging. I shut the door tightly this time, locking it, but the sound still stopped just outside. I sat in bed, trembling, watching the handle. It didn't turn, but I swear I saw it twitch just enough to tell me I wasn't safe. As weeks passed, the encounters escalated. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and hear the footsteps pacing back and forth outside, as if restless, waiting. Other times, I'd hear them circle my room, as though searching for a way inside. I stopped sleeping soundly, always half awake, ears straining for the sound that had become all too familiar. One night in particular is burned into my memory. I had been dozing when I woke suddenly to silence. Too much silence. I glanced toward the door and froze. Beneath the gap at the bottom, I could see it, a pair of bare, pale feet standing motionless on the other side. They stayed there for what felt like hours, not moving, not making a sound, until finally they slipped away. That was the night I realized it wasn't just footsteps. There was something attached to them. Something that knew I was inside, watching, listening. Something that wanted me to open the door. I tried sleeping in the living room after that, thinking maybe it was tied to my bedroom, but the footsteps followed. I heard them descending the stairs in the middle of the night, moving across the carpet toward the couch where I lay. Once, I even felt the faint press of weight at the foot of the couch, as if someone had sat down while I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for morning. I stopped telling my parents. They wouldn't believe me, and I didn't want them thinking I was losing my mind. But I started to notice little changes in myself. Dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep, constant anxiety, jumping at every sound. My friends at school teased me for being so tired all the time, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that something was haunting me every night with nothing more than its presence, its endless pacing outside my door? The final straw came a month later. I woke to the sound again. Slow, deliberate steps. Only this time, they didn't stop outside the door. They entered. I know how it sounds. My door had been locked, but I heard it open, the hinges creaking softly. I sat upright, frozen with terror, as the footsteps came closer, crossing the floor of my bedroom. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt it. The air shifted, colder, heavier. The footsteps stopped beside my bed, and then the whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I had imagined it, but it was there, right beside my ear. "Let me in." I screamed, bolting upright, fumbling for the lamp. The light clicked on, and my room was empty. The door was still closed, locked from the inside. My chest heaved as I tried to convince myself I had dreamed it, but the sound had been too real, too close. Since that night, the footsteps have never entered again, but they haven't gone away either. Every night, they return, stopping outside my door, waiting. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: it won't leave. And the worst part? Some nights, when the house is completely still and I'm almost asleep, I hear the faintest sound just inches from my door. Soft, patient breathing, waiting for the moment I make the mistake of letting it in. Story 3. The stairwell that never fell silent. When I moved into the old apartment building, I didn't think much of the place. It was cheap, close to where I worked, and had just enough space for me and the few things I owned. The building itself was built in the 1930s, with cracked plaster walls, wooden staircases that creaked under your weight, and narrow hallways that always seemed a little too dim, no matter how many light bulbs were replaced. It wasn't pretty, but it was practical. My apartment was on the 4th floor, which meant I had to climb the central stairwell every day. The elevator hadn't worked in years, and no one expected it to ever work again. At first, the constant climb was just an annoyance. But soon enough, the stairwell became something else entirely. Something I dreaded more than anything. The first time I noticed the footsteps, it was late at night. I'd gone down to the lobby to check my mailbox, and on my way back up, I heard slow, deliberate steps behind me. The stairwell was tight and echoey, so footsteps always carried, but these sounded wrong. They didn't match mine. Every time I paused, they paused too, lagging a second after me, as though whoever, or whatever it was, hadn't expected me to stop. I turned around, but no one was there. The stairwell was empty. I shook it off, blaming it on echoes. After all, in old buildings like this, sound bounced around strangely. But then, when I resumed climbing, the steps resumed too. A half second behind me, always behind me. By the time I got to my apartment, I was nearly running. I locked the door, leaned against it, and laughed nervously at myself. I told myself I was being paranoid. The next morning, everything felt normal again. For a while, I managed to push it out of my mind. But over the following weeks, the footsteps became a constant presence. I'd hear them every night on my way upstairs, always 1 or 2 steps behind. Sometimes they were heavier, sometimes lighter, but always there. I tried to catch whoever was doing it. Once, I spun around suddenly, hoping to confront some prankster neighbor. But the stairwell was always empty. It got worse when I realized the footsteps didn't stop when I reached my apartment. They lingered outside my door, pacing back and forth in the hallway, long after I'd locked myself inside. I'd lie in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to the slow, steady tread outside. Sometimes it sounded like someone was dragging their feet. Sometimes like they were barefoot. One night, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the sound didn't stop. I could hear it, plain as day, someone walking right past my door, over and over. I remember pressing my ear to the door, heart pounding, and the steps stopped instantly, as though whoever was there knew I was listening. I didn't sleep that night. Things escalated. The footsteps began following me even when I wasn't in the stairwell. Once, while cooking dinner, I heard them behind me in my kitchen. I spun around, knife in hand, but no one was there. Another time, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone climbing out of my closet, slow, deliberate steps crossing the room toward my bed. When I turned on the light, nothing was there. At that point, I thought I was losing my mind. I confided in a neighbor, an old woman who'd lived in the building for decades. She gave me a long, pitying look and told me I wasn't the first. "That stairwell's never silent," she said. "People hear things, footsteps that don't belong to anyone, sometimes more than footsteps. That's why most folks don't stay here long." When I pressed her for more details, she shook her head. "Just keep your door locked at night, and don't follow the steps if they ever sound like they're leading you somewhere." Her words haunted me, and soon the footsteps began to change. They weren't just following me anymore. They started trying to lead me. It happened one stormy night when the building's power went out. I lit a candle and sat on the couch, trying not to panic in the dark silence. Then I heard them, the footsteps, descending the stairwell outside my apartment, one step at a time, pausing, waiting, and then continuing downward. They wanted me to follow. I felt it, like some invisible rope tugging at me, urging me to step outside, to go down after them. The thought terrified me, but at the same time, I felt almost compelled. My hand even rested on the doorknob before I snapped myself out of it and backed away. That night, the steps went on for hours, circling the stairwell, pacing the halls, stopping just outside my door. By morning, I was shaking and sleep-deprived, convinced that if I had followed, I wouldn't have come back. Things only got darker from there. One evening, I returned home from work, exhausted, and halfway up the stairwell, I froze. The steps weren't behind me anymore. They were above me, heavy, deliberate, echoing down as though someone was waiting for me on the next landing. I stood there, clutching the railing, trying to decide whether to keep going or retreat. Then, with agonizing slowness, the steps began descending toward me. I bolted. I don't remember reaching my apartment. I just remember slamming the door shut and collapsing on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. That was the night I decided I had to leave. I packed my things over the next week, barely sleeping, barely eating. The footsteps followed me everywhere, in the stairwell, in my apartment, even in my dreams. On my last night there, as I stood surrounded by boxes, I heard them one final time. Not outside, not in the stairwell, but inside my apartment. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor toward me. I fled, left everything behind. When I returned weeks later with a moving company to collect the rest of my belongings, the apartment was empty. Not just of my things, but of sound. For the first time since I'd moved in, the stairwell was silent. But I know silence doesn't last, and even now, when I walk home late at night in my new building, I sometimes hear it, the faint echo of footsteps, just a step behind mine, waiting for me to notice. No matter how far we run, or how tightly we close the door, there's something about footsteps that chills us to the core, because footsteps mean someone or something is close behind. These stories prove that sometimes the sound isn't a trick of the mind. Sometimes it's real, and it wants to be heard. If you've ever felt those steps following you in the dark, remember, you're not the only one who's heard them getting closer.